Welcome to another edition of the Dragonproof e-commerce podcast. I am Richard Otey, and I'm here with Rick Wilson.
Hello, everybody.
And Jeff Pandolfo.
Hello. Great to meet you.
And we're excited to have Jeff as our guest today. Jeff's in from Visa, and we'll probably get a little bit more into some of their other companies beneath them, Authorize.net and Cybersource. But we're excited to have you on, and I know Rick's been excited to have you on, so let's get this started.
Yeah, in fact, Jeff's one of the rare people who has a tenure as long as mine in e-commerce. He was at Amazon for 8 years, and then he's been with Visa for 8 years, specifically within Authorize.net and Cybersource. If you hear Jeff call it Cybes, that's what he means.
Yeah.
Or Internet.
Terrible habit.
Yeah. But Jeff, I've known Jeff now for 11 or 12 years via my tenure at Miva. And I thought he would be a really great guest to bring on here because he has a bigger bird's eye view than I do. I mean, I don't know, how many merchants do you guys service at Authorize.net roughly?
It's clocking in the high 400s.
Yeah,
and
thousands, by the way.
Yeah, if you actually combine the Cybersource and ANET portfolios, you're upwards of 500,000.
Yeah, and that's an immense perspective on the market, right? I mean, to be able to see what's working and not working and where the trends are. So that's one of the reasons we invited Jeff here. Plus, he's an all-around great guy and conversationalist.
Yeah, so, I mean, you have a very interesting perspective because not only at Visa, but you have insight into the Dragon, too.
Yeah, it's funny. It was totally unintentional, right? I didn't know Rick was actually writing the book and what it would be about. And, when it happened to be on a defensive positioning, or just more of how do you incent or think about what he calls the Dragon, and how do you bring that into your everyday life as a merchant? It was serendipitous, right? That my tenure at Amazon during a very growth oriented time there, the growth of web services, the growth of web stores, the growth of Checkout by Amazon, the growth of other assets that are merchant related is very relevant because during that time Amazon was trying to make increased strides, right, to improve the merchant on and off Amazon experience. And I lived through a lot of that, either directly because I worked on the projects or products, or indirectly because I might have been supporting them or tangentially aligned to them. So it was very serendipitous that he writes about an environment that I did spend a lot of time in.
Mm-hmm. So what is your view in this world? I mean, how do you see the world for independent sellers who are not Amazon? Anyone who's not Amazon?
It's funny because the conversation that often happens between me and technologists or small business leaders or mid-market CEOs or even enterprise CEOs is amazingly getting more consistent over time. I think during the earliest days of Amazon, the earliest days of Authorize.net, Cybersource, PayPal, Braintree, those other ones, there was an amazing fragmentation of services and costs and functionality available to the SMB merchant. And where my narrative has often changed today, where I think I've got very common conversations with leaders and influencers of all different size companies, is you can do more today for a price that's unheard of and get a lot done without a lot of work. That's kind of general speaking, but in other words, the growth of platforms like Miva, where you've taken a bunch of disparate business operations and driven them into a fairly monolithic environment, for one price, you can do an awful lot of that environment. And the things that I often see enterprises struggle with are now almost table stakes for SMBs. So I think that's how the conversation has changed. The competition has driven more functionality at a lower price point and allowed merchants to, even net new merchants, to actually conduct business using tools that rivaled their enterprise counterparts 5, 7, 10 years ago.
I absolutely see the same thing. I mean, in fact, I find, without naming any specific sites, because some of them I'm big fans of as a customer, but if you've got a big brand who's been around for, say, a long time, a staid brand, that put all their money into it 15 years ago, oftentimes the shopping experience there is worse than what you see on an SMB who's got a nimble new site today. So we see the same thing, and I see the same thing.
Yeah, and I think the other it's a little more difficult to answer is what's the potential future hold? Like, there's a tremendous amount of competition for the SMB today, and arguably you see enterprise class platforms now scratching their head. How do I attract growth by going down to the mid market? And you see SMB-centric platforms now trying to flex their muscles and saying, how do I go up to mid-market and eventually enterprise? Great dynamics in the industry. We love seeing it. So on the payment side, we participate in all aspects of that, so it's good for us. But I just love to see the competition and the growth. And the other thing is, the number of, let's say, e-commerce platforms in the industry or on the market today hasn't radically changed over the past 10 or 15 years.
No, it hasn't. In fact, one thing that's really interesting, I was at a conference last month, and if you count when we repurchased Miva in 07, Miva, Shopify, Magento, and BigCommerce all emerged between 06 and 08. I mean, we all just, those four platforms came out. And if you count, NetSuite's kind of buying an emergence at that point was similar too. And so there has not been a lot of new entrants since then. I think part of that is the regulatory environment around running an e-commerce platform has gotten tougher. Not do any specific regulations aimed at e-commerce, but there's data protection rules, and those are getting increasingly tougher. You have PCI, and just web security in general has gotten incredibly challenging. Where when we started Miva in the .com boom era, it was throw some scripts together and get a checkout button. And SSL was a what's that kind of thing, right? And nowadays, it's like the sentries are on full alert at all times. And so, yeah, I've noticed that too, that the platform business has gotten incredibly stable.
Yeah.
Have you seen anything, since I'm assuming you guys have insights and data and analytics that a lot of people don't get access to. Do you see any common theme in growth or something that people are doing, or do you really take a look at that?
We do. And, we tend to put a certain lens on the data depending on what product we're operating from. Yes, Visa has a broad view of merchant data and acquirer data and issuer data. But that's not necessarily actionable down in, let's say, the CyberSource and authorized.net world that we operate in and Rick operates in on a daily basis. So we tend to have a different lens on that data. And we tend to we have different hunches, and we tend to look for different patterns in that activity. But we also have the ability that I think the broader VC ecosystem doesn't necessarily have access to, is we've got close partnerships with the platform providers, right? And whether it's a B2B platform, whether it's an e-commerce platform, whether it's a niche product, actually coordinating our data with theirs tends to generate the best results, and then gives you better insights. So that type of generalization, sure, we can say we know how long it takes when someone signs up for payments the very first time and conducts the first transaction. And we can assume there's activity happening between those 2 points. For SMBs that come in from the web, that create accounts and then go live, hypothetically, let's say that was 60 days between average of sign up to first transaction. So if we know they came from the Miva platform or insert product name here, we can work with the ops teams on those environments and say, okay, we saw this merchant come in. What were they doing over 60 days? And I think Rick and the operations team and the AEs at Miva will tell you, well, payments is one step of 20 they've got to do to launch a store. And most of their time is going to be doing things like loading the catalog, making sure they've refined the nav and the checkout experience, whatever they need to do for back-end business operations. So that's where it's very important, where we have to work with our corresponding technology platform providers to come up with real reasonable data. Because if we look at just the transaction data alone, it tells us some things, but the biggest value is going to be in partnership, according to that data with the partners.
So let me switch gears just a little bit. As a consumer, and all-around person who likes looking at technology like I do, what things do you get drawn to buy off of Amazon?
It's amazing how it's changed. When I used to work there, like I was doing a renovation and I was renovating the kitchen in my house and then renovated the bathroom. So surprisingly, I bought a number of building materials, basically faucets and handles and things like that, off of Amazon. I remember there was an SVP at the time who actually renovated his whole house, and he had a goal of buying everything except the construction services off of Amazon. And some things he couldn't get, but everything from the appliances to small major appliances, small appliances, and everything between he did. So when I was there, it was, okay, what do I need for me? How that's changed in the past, 4, 5, 6 years is I'm now at the stage, I'm also old enough that I pretty much got everything I need. And if it's something I want, I probably can't afford it anyway. So what I typically find is what I'm searching and browsing and buying on Amazon is that known brands for gifts, I do a lot of. And if I do something for myself, again, it's well-researched product. It's a known experience as well. What I also find is that my consumption of digital assets or digital products has increased tremendously. And that's probably the biggest indicator of what's changed my Amazon buying experience. Even though I've been out of that environment for so long, is that I'm now consuming more digital content than I did before.
And I would assume a fair amount of that's non-Amazon digital content.
Yeah, correct. Yeah.
Yeah.
Video, music.
Yep.
I'm still old school. I'm the type that will still buy a used CD and rip it because I can have a higher audio quality than the streamed version. But it still doesn't preclude me from, one of my Bose radios or one of my Echo devices to queue up a radio station or some music I've added to my library, or pull up Amazon Prime Video on the TV and watch an episode of Bosch. That's pretty common nowadays.
Well, at least you buy the CD.
I do. And it's funny. The other thing I've also noticed as well is, and Amazon, and this actually ties well into e-commerce in general, but the global barriers for shipping and fulfillment have come way down. It's not that it's not expensive, but just the other week, I bought a t-shirt off of Amazon. And the t-shirt's imprinted with the logo of a synthesizer company from the early 80s called Sequential Circuits. And it's a t-shirt you'd never find, and it's a modern t-shirt by all means, but that item was actually fulfilled out of the UK. And it was part of my Prime shipping. It showed up, I think, 5 days after I purchased it. So to me, that was very impressive, that those types of boundaries for sellers to be anywhere and buyers to be anywhere, I think those barriers are changing. In fact, that's probably one of the biggest opportunities in the next 5-8 years, is truly globalization of sales does become easier.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I've noticed that too, and I've noticed from the seller's perspective, both, well, obviously on Amazon, if you're using Amazon fulfillment, you piggyback on that, but almost everywhere I shop from online now today fulfills in a manner very similar to Prime, right? Most things show up in 2-3 days at most, right? I don't worry about it anymore. Prime as a defensive moat for Amazon that's separated from everyone else has really been declinated in a good way. That's where competition's really helped customers, the end users, out greatly, because we get our products and we trust it.
But I think, one of the things we can talk about is one of the great opportunities for small to mid-sized businesses today is the general Amazon Prime model. Even though that is subscription, let's look at it at a base level, it is quasi-instantaneous fulfillment. I mean, getting that product on the truck in short time, and ideally it's getting to you within a couple of days. But now with the rise of really good logistics services, the web services around those logistics services, merchants are really getting darn close to having similar offerings through different platforms for their customers. So I think even though Amazon pioneered that mechanism or that model of Prime shipping via subscription and 2-3 day fulfillment, got to read the fine print on what that 2-day actually is. But now there's enough available. Like I said, the democratization of a lot of these back-end services is at the point where through a Shippo or a ShipBob or a ShipStation or Prologis and anyone in between, you can now, through your e-commerce platform in a partnership with them, get access to warehousing and fulfillment and actually get close to 2-day delivery times for your customers. And so that's unprecedented. I think that's a great asset in the market today. They really wasn't there 4 or 5 years ago.
Yeah, no, not at all. That is a new development that's changed. Speaking of big things, I mean, you mentioned that's one of the next big things. What else do you see is coming as the next big thing in e-commerce, kind of being democratized or broadly available?
Oh boy, yeah. So I think there's a couple of things. The back office elements are still a big problem, right? In anyone's given revenue stream, whether they're enterprise or SMB, an inordinate amount of funds or percentage of the revenue is plugging together, duct taping, or trying to make back-end things work, from printing the shipping label to putting the box on, dealing with the chargeback, making sure their buyers aren't overbuying and overloading part of the warehouse, optimizing the location of objects in a warehouse. Those have nothing to do with the e-commerce website. Yet they can consume 40% or 50% of someone's revenue in order to address. I need an ERP system, I need process, I need real estate space in the warehouse, things like that we often don't think about. So the merchant's got to deal with a lot more. But like I said, the assets and tools to make those happen are getting better. So I think on one hand, the back office services get cheaper and more ubiquitous that improve the merchant's overall performance. You're now seeing great growth in tax as a service services, right? Look at the growth of, Avalara, for example, like it's everywhere now. Like the ability to now have someone be your virtual accountant, collect tax through the e-commerce platform, and then remit it on a per state or per country basis. You don't have to. Like, yeah, I'll pay a couple points to do that. And I think that gets better, right? We talked about logistics and fulfillment. Those continue to grow and become more attractive for merchants. And once they kind of understand them, like I said, those are assets that were normally kind of figured out by the enterprises, although they were totally unscalable outside that enterprise. Right. But the fact is now that they're more democratized through a platform like Amiva, I still think there's a lot of legwork or a lot of a runway left there. Kind of looking upstream though, some of the newer technologies that I think will start making an impact is, again, a little bit more on the front end, or perhaps the decoupling, right, of the front end, the visuals of the website, and the back end ERP and transaction systems, right? Sometimes the terminology is headless commerce today. Who knows how that'll change? But I think that's one of the growing technical assets we're going to see a lot more of, where there's a decoupling of the front end from the back end, giving the people that run the front end liberty to do and change what they want without breaking or disrupting the ERP system or the customer service system, and vice versa. Those are still in their infancy, by the way. I think they were driven by enterprise need to have modular systems where they could do certain functions and pull modules together to do what they need. But I think we'll see much more growth and opportunity there, especially in the e-commerce space.
Are you seeing, when you refer to like the headless commerce, I know this isn't exactly the same, but have you seen a trend in more money coming from marketplaces or more money coming from the actual e-commerce? Because I noticed you said you go to Amazon to look for a specific brand.
Yeah.
I don't ever do discovery on, I only go for a brand, but then there's other sites that I only want to go to their site to experience the brand experience.
Yeah.
So have you noticed anything change in payments, or is there any trends that you see that are consistent or inconsistent
in marketplaces versus like direct to merchant? When it comes to marketplaces, I'm jaded, right? I spent a lot of my career like working on the world's largest marketplace, and the way you manage payments and customer service and operations in a marketplace is radically different than a customer coming to your website to check out. The kind of intermediary role of handling the transaction, providing some type of coverage or indemnity, then providing all the other assets the merchant needs, like how do I print a shipping label and how do I know who bought something and what to ship to? That's not minor. That's pretty complex. And I think you haven't really seen the growth of marketplaces as a service in general. There are a few of them out there. They haven't made a lot of traction. I think we'll probably see some movement. I think Miracle was one of the more recent ones that crosses my field of view, for example. But marketplaces as services where people can build new marketplaces on hasn't been a lot of activity just yet.
Yeah, that's been one of those things that's been kind of bantered about for 20 years, but it hasn't taken off. And going back to the headless commerce or kind of decoupling process, and I would assume this is part of what you saw at Amazon. I believe when you got to Amazon, they were still, the whole system was pretty monolithic, and the AWS evolution really, which arguably the thing about being Dragonproof is that, we're not, I don't propose being anti-Amazon. I propose understanding how to live in a world where Amazon's the dominant player. And someday if it's not Amazon, there's going to be a new dominant player. So just how to live in a world of dominant players. But Amazon has used AWS to decouple itself. And I think we could view that as an evolutionary step to how the rest of us will do it if we haven't already. Thoughts on that?
No, I think that's absolutely right. And going back to Amazon, one of the big driving forces that became the thesis for AWS is if we've already built all these customized services internally, can we productize them? Because if we're doing them and we treat everything as a small little independent service with its own kind of internal service contract that's got a handful of APIs and a handful of responses, can I turn that into a product? And yeah, that became the foundation for AWS, whether it's compute cloud, storage cloud, the queue, those are the early ones. And even the early payment system was an interesting decoupling of the Amazon ecosystem as well. Again, those don't necessarily, in today's day and age, as we see it from, again, the CyberSource and ANET lens, they don't make their way directly into the merchant. Those are consumed by the Rick Wilsons that are leading, today's and tomorrow's e-commerce platforms. Like, they're the ones that are best to take advantage of it. So when we talk about what do we see as some of the growth opportunities, or what are the cool technologies that are going to make themselves known, there's tech that the merchant's going to consume that they'll relate to and grok and understand. And I think those are going to be predominantly aimed at improving the efficiency of their business. And again, as we said earlier, growing cross-border will be some great opportunity. But then we have to look at it from Rick's lens or Miva's lens, and those assets that allowed the assets that Amazon created to decouple pieces of the business are now within Rick's field of view, right? He can actually be, consuming those services or other web services,
Sure,
and bring Miva to that level. So if we look at it from your lens, I think there's a new round of opportunity, right, to build the next gen scalable Miva environment.
Well, absolutely. And I would say, one thing that has not been touched that much in the SMB side or even mid-market side of e-commerce yet is where machine learning is going. But the fact of the matter is, we have access to a machine learning compute clouds with Amazon, Azure, all over, Google, and I don't have to have a team of PhD scientists figuring out how to write a custom chip, right? So I don't need custom silicon to participate in that world, and that is one of the ways you see these the market dynamics democratizing these tools for everyone, and it's interesting, and you see this a lot. Sometimes you'll bring up companies to me, have you looked at this one yet or looked at that one yet? And I would say in the last 12 months, it almost always starts with, well, they have a machine learning algorithm. What kind of changes, evolutions in the payment space have you seen, whether it's AI, machine learning or not, that's been beneficial to the merchants? Anything on fraud, anything on that kind of stuff?
Yeah, and I think that's a good point. I think fraud is the low-hanging fruit to apply those new tech. And I think the tech's still in its very nascent stage, because machine learning is always backed up by a human counterpart, because there's always these things that the machine can't learn from just yet. They fall out to a human queue, and the human does a couple of tasks, and patterns are looked for, and then they're reintegrated into the environment. But so they still have a very strong human dependency. So they're not true AI systems yet. It really isn't only a matter of time, but fraud is a low-hanging bit of fruit there for merchants to take advantage of. And again, the more advanced merchant will be investing it into their own, whether they use like a CIF Science environment or something like that, if they're big enough.
Or Signified now.
Or Signified.
Yep.
Actually, Signified's done a pretty incredible job of taking some really good machine learning and AI and making it super, super digestible. I mean, all you have to know as a merchant that for a couple of points on a given transaction or a pool of transactions, I'm essentially covering, it's like indemnity policy on this transaction. So if that box ends up going to a vacant lot in Sheboygan, Wisconsin, it's not going to be or a chargeback occurs, right? It's not going to be skin off the merchant's back. And that system, the Signified system, is working off a massive pool of data to make its predictions and calculations if this transaction is going to be good or not. And so I think that becoming available to the merchant is as simple as click here, sign up for Signified, pay a couple of points, and you could probably realize a few $1,000s of free cash flow, because we can bring your fraud levels from X down to Y, or chargeback levels from X down to Y. And those things are fantastic. And again, the merchant doesn't necessarily need to know it's machine learning or AI behind it, but they're becoming readily available.
Yeah, it's the concept of being kind of automagical. It just works.
Absolutely, yeah.
Switching topics on you a little bit, one thing I've been impressed with watching Authorize.net specifically, I've worked with Authorize.net and CyberSource for 20 years each, but closer with Authorize.net just because more of our customers use them. And one thing that's impressed me about Visa's stewardship, I guess I'd say, for Authorize.net is that it still feels like the same company that it was before they bought them. How do you think that, or if you're allowed to answer that question, how do you think they pulled that off?
I can. It's funny because it's when you look at it from the outside, you don't always see it. It's not that obvious. But I think number one, you've got people that have been with Authorize.net, some from the inception of Authorize.net. They're that passionate about what they've done. Number two, they were always this philosophical family-run company, right? And that has been endemic in the type of people they hired. They want people that work well together, that have a sense of community and camaraderie, as well as having a passion for customers and payments. Like the payments biz isn't very big in the end of the day. Yeah. Every conference you go to, you recognize all the same faces. But I think those have contributed to that kind of very communal nature of ANET, where everyone knows everyone, they work together, and they have this really, really strong passion for the customer, the merchant, as well as the developer. ANET would never have gotten where it's gotten today had they not been focused on creating developer services, basically opening up the APIs and making payments doable. So that is really, I think, obvious once you spend time with the ANET teams, more than a lot of other things. There's not a lot of churn in that environment. People come, they love it, and they stay. So that is actually filtered right into the product. And the other thing is, the most important piece of it is the merchants see that as well, right?
Yeah, I mean, the reason what made me think of that question is you talked about simplified a machine learning tool to a point where the merchant doesn't have to understand what's happening. And that what I keyed in on there is I feel like Authorize.net does that for its merchants, right? And Miva does that for our merchants too. You know, we're not really explaining how the technology works to our merchants, right? It's our job to make sure it works. And it's our job to provide the translation layer to an entrepreneur or a business owner. I mean, the human translation layer, right? They don't care about API limits, right? You know, I see this in platforms all the time, whether it's e-commerce or ERPs. You know, and there's logical reasons why you have an API limiter, right? Because it's obvious. Otherwise, everything comes crashing down. But merchants don't really have a lot of empathy for that because they don't understand it, right? And so it's the job of the platforms, whether it's Authorize.net or Miva or Signified, to really make the information accessible to the merchant in a way that they can understand it.
Mm-hmm. And also, I think it's easy to overlook the human touch.
Yeah.
Right. And it may not mean much to a lot of folks, but you know, an Authorize.net customer has unlimited phone support. And I think, well, that's table stakes. Well, in today's day and age, it's not. I mean, so many of these other environments that have reached scale with very few people can't really spool up a customer service, let alone a follow the sun customer service team, where after a couple of rings, there's a human on the phone. And when you talk to the CS team or the CS org, they get questions all over the board, and they're professional and positive, and that builds goodwill over time. And that's not a minor element of the business. There's a lot of time and expense to do that and do it well. And Authorize.net wins awards year over year for its customer service. So what might not be that obvious to folks, treating the customer, aka the merchant, well throughout the entire lifespan of the merchant is hyper important. And I think if we look at the average tenure of a merchant on the Authorize.net payment platform, it's not minor. Like, they're not coming in January and then exiting the following January. They're on for year over year over year. And I think this is the big cycle and the value that kind of the older elements of ANET are still very relevant in today's modern payments world.
Yeah. You know, and that kind of springs to mind. You earlier were talking about a lot of the optimizations you see coming in the marketplace are almost back office operations. And how do you see that tying into nurturing customer relationships, right? Because I mean, you know, we all know from a marketing standpoint, you know, the old adage is about X times more expensive to get a new customer. But, you know, I don't know that merchants always connect customer experience with back office operations. What are your thoughts on that?
You know, and that's probably, you know, I think to one of the earlier questions about what could merchants do or what should they be thinking about to take advantage of in the future. That's often overlooked. Sometimes for new merchants, things like that are overlooked, is defining the customer journey. And I would argue that every SMB and every enterprise goes through that exercise, is write the narrative of your customer's experience as if you were the customer. Don't sit there and say, hey, I went and talked to a bunch of customers that gave me a bunch of to-do items and those become my requirements. I mean, that's working against the past. That's rearview mirror stuff. But you should be that tuned in. And again, whether you're a small biz or an enterprise or mid-market, writing that narrative as if you were the customer and working off of that to define what you want as the UI experience or what needs to happen. If you believe that once I click and these events happen, what are the things I have to do in the back office to make those happen? I think that's probably the biggest gap I see with a lot of businesses, is that they inherently think they are automatically creative and optimized if they use a monolithic e-commerce platform, and they haven't really given any thought to designing or thinking about the full end-to-end customer experience, from the purchase to the order inquiry to customer support to return. And I think there's a lot of back office elements that have to happen there to say, look, if this is what I want, here are the things I have to turn on or enable or buy to make that work.
Yeah, I mean, it's it's the rise of YouTube and the unboxing video, right? And how much effort now goes into literally taking a product out of a box. But that's not an accident, because that's part of that customer journey. Yeah. And I'm a big Apple fan, as anyone who's followed me knows. But I can also acknowledge Apple's missteps. So I had one of those, the original 15-inch MacBook Pros with the Touch Bar, and that virtual escape key made me nuts. And so when they finally released the new 16-inch one, it had been a few years. So I was like, I'm going to pass this one down to another employee, and I'm getting a real escape key. And it's so funny how that little thing of that escape key has reignited my passion for this particular machine, because now I'm no longer 10 times a day being like, I just deleted an email, right? And so I think you're right. So on that note, what are things, any specific things you've seen customers who are trying to stay relevant, or merchants who are trying to stay relevant in the age of the Amazon Dragon, where they're failing on the low-hanging fruit, where they're struggling, where it shouldn't be that hard for them?
I think number one, not taking advantage of a broader range of services provided to them by their e-commerce platform. Again, keeping the lens of SMB, like there's a tremendous amount you can do with a single platform without having to worry about plugging in 3 or 4 or 5 external services. There's enough to get started with and grow with. So I think number one is underinvesting in customer service, and underinvesting in nav, the idea of search browse to checkout, and not being critical about that, like taking whatever the platform offers you and assume that that's the best, which might mean under load, it's slow. It might mean 12 clicks to get something in the cart. Again, don't assume just because you're using an off-the-shelf service or piece of software that it's designed with you in mind. So I think those are areas where small merchants or new merchants should be critical. And I think existing merchants should always be testing themselves as well. Like they should have impartial set of eyes and perspectives come in and critique the 4 main or 3 main assets of their experience: the purchase experience, the customer service experience, and the return experience. Sure. And then calibrate their strategies against that, and then say, look, if these 3 things are at the top that are pain points, what do I have at my fingertips that I'm not activating? I think other than that is you get a hold of your account manager. If you're going to invest in an e-commerce platform and you're going to spend some time building your business or operating your business out of it, then use the assets that platform has available. If you've got an account manager, use that account manager to the fullest. Like they're going to know how to help you get the best out of the platform. Hey, Rick, I'm having a problem. I seem to be struggling with order management. What am I doing wrong? Jeff, here's a couple of videos, and then so-and-so is going to take you through how to optimize your ship routine for twice a day. Like those things, I don't think a lot of merchants are necessarily taking advantage of. They're trying to solve it themselves. It's kind of like managing your own investment portfolio. Yep. Sometimes you can do it, but other times the assets are best. If you leverage those services, you could have a surprising amount of gains in efficiency.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that begets the opposite side of that question, and maybe even a specific merchant if you have one that comes to mind. What's something that's just delighted you, that you've bumped into, even if it's a tiny merchant no one's heard of? Anything you've seen that's just that you were like, wow, that was a really cool, great experience?
Boy, like in our world, especially with authorized.net, to say that CyberSource is more serious, I'm not meaning that, but I mean that because authorized.net is an SMB-oriented environment, we definitely see some very unique things happening. I don't recall the names, but there's a company that sells air-conditioned doghouses, for example. Like, I don't think we'd ever see this in the CyberSource world, and he probably does them build to order. But we find things like that. So I see like people, even what might seem like crazy ideas, are building businesses around them. So that always, we love that. And internally within authorized.net, when we get together as a large group, we often try to come up with or present an off the wall, or I bet you never thought this could be sold, and authorized.net is processing the payments. So that usually is, it's good for laughs, but at the same time, it's there's reverence there. I mean, everyone's like, wow. I mean, if it wasn't because of us and what we did, that item couldn't be sold. So there are types of items being sold that make us laugh all the time and make us smile and feel proud. And then it's also very serious stuff. Like some of the things that just like boggle our mind have to do with throughput. Like some of the ticketing and event management platforms that use authorized.net, for example, especially during when tickets go on sale for an event, whether it's Coachella or whether it's Burning Man.
Yeah, the race conditions in those cases are incredible.
It's crazy. And the throughput they can pump through a system dwarfs the e-commerce world.
Oh, yeah.
But that throughput happens in a very narrow window. And we watch, just little blips, like in terms of how we see that load. And that's also we feel very proud about that. It's like our systems don't break a sweat, when those very spurious activities happen. So again, the world doesn't necessarily know that, but we look on that very proudly that, we've engineered some really, really scalable payment processing systems. And that impresses us as well. And again, at the end of the day, what makes it rewarding is that we spend a lot of time building and promoting a public-facing API for payments. And arguably, I hate to say it, but we don't need to know who you are, right? And so sometimes we'll see jumps in activity or unique things happening in terms of an order value or the location of orders or the number of orders in a given window of time. And it's like, what is that? We look into it, reach out, and we get rewarded by what that might be.
Yeah, and you find out that Burning Man just tried to sell 500,000 tickets for 60,000 people in 2 minutes.
Exactly.
Yeah,
So,
that reminds me very much of Miva. I think that's culturally why we've always felt a kinship with authorized.net is, and I think that goes to the point of what's in the book, which is, I think technology, as much as Amazon is this big thing, but I'm also a big customer of Amazon's and I like Amazon. There are so many things you can buy and imagine and build businesses around today that simply weren't possible 20 years ago.
Yeah.
Richie, any other thoughts you want to go into before we wrap for the day?
No, I just want to reiterate and say that it's refreshing to have such a big company, big brand that almost most people don't really know, hey, that was a great experience with Visa, right? But yet it's refreshing to hear from you that's what you're thinking about through the whole process. And just one question I would have is, in this experience, is there something that came out organically that you might have been thinking about that you say, I really wanted to say this one last thing? You don't have to, but I just know when you have there's things we want to cover, there's things that are going on in the brain. And so in this experience, kind of hearing out, got to be a brand, you got to think of your customer's experience. Is there anything that we didn't?
Yeah, one thing that comes to mind is, not to be afraid of taking advantage of new technologies. And I will speak from the lens or the perspective of payments. Like this, as steadfast as that may look, we invest a lot of time and effort in building out the next generation services, right? That really offer potentially new opportunities for handling things like marketplaces. So, we need to have broader discussions with the platform environments around direct payments. Like, what if you could push payments to a credit or a debit card in a marketplace scenario or in a gig economy? Like, those aren't going to be done by merchants themselves. Those are going to be executed by platforms, right? And I think that's exciting stuff. The ability to say, look, I've got an environment, whether it's for an affiliate system, whether it's for human workers to do tasks, whether it's for drivers or whatever. But now I have assets via my payment provider to push payments to them. And guess what? It's all being illuminated by the platform providers. So I think I would encourage people to think more aggressively and look at the services that are now coming out or coming online from the payment providers and think about how you can take advantage of those in a way that you couldn't before. Things like digital wallets. I really, encourage people to embrace that world of Apple Pay and Google Pay and the pays in general on the mobile device. It's an excellent way to bridge the gap, right, between the online experience and the future in-store experience. And that's my last, idea or plug, so to speak, is the world of integrated commerce, right? Enterprises have often struggled with that if they've got an online site and they've got multiple stores. Again, this is a enterprise class problem. But now if I look at it from an SMB or mid-market lens, things have gotten a lot easier. They're not perfect. You still have to tie things together. But I think they're great opportunities to break down that barrier. And we think about when we search and browse and buy online, it is radically different than when we search, browse, and buy in store. In store, we're reaching for our wallets and pulling out our credit cards. What if we could seamlessly make that experience the same between the online world and the in-store world, right? What if I could check out on a Miva-powered store, as I go to check out, maybe I check out with Apple Pay on the web or I use my phone. What if that was the same, or Google Pay, or what if that was the same as I walked into the store? And what if that was the same if it was the same merchant? Right? So things like that, I think businesses have better access to today to kind of break down that barrier and be a little more cutting edge. And I'd encourage folks to take a look at and think a little more creatively. Don't always think it's got to be a checkout routine where you enter a credit card into a box. Think beyond that. And the tools are pretty much you're going to find at your fingertips.
Awesome. Well, thanks for coming on the show. We love having you. Any other particular things, or pretty much?
I guess the only thing I would say is what I heard Jeff just say was, your customers are, if you're a merchant, your customers are evolving. So you got to keep evolving too, right? Because customers, I know what I expect now from a checkout experience is different than it was. No, not just checkout, the whole thing. And so I think Jeff's right on. I think when a business assumes they know what their customers want and they stop questioning it is when they run into stops.
Yeah,
so.
exactly.
All right, so it's time to get back to work. Hope you enjoyed this experience here on the Dragonproof e-commerce podcast. And until next time, stay Dragonproof.